Hello, this is Father Hightower, and welcome to VOX SFX, the voice of St. Francis Xavier Parish in Missoula, Montana, and sponsored in part by the Foundation for the Diocese of Helena. We are so pleased that you have joined us. Your participation enriches our community. We hope that our show serves as a point of light, helping to deepen our understanding and experience of the Catholic faith and history. Join us as we seek, through prayer, study, interviews, and discussion, the roots of our ancient mysteries.
Hello, and welcome to VOX SFX, the podcast from St. Francis Xavier Church here in Missoula. Today we are turning the tables. The interviewer becomes the interviewee. Today's special guest is none other than our own Nicholas Brouillard, the host of VOX SFX. Stay tuned as we begin to learn about Nicholas's faith journey, a journey that has brought him to the Catholic Church. Hello, everyone, and welcome to VOX SFX, the podcast from St. Francis Xavier Parish in Missoula, Montana. If you don't recognize my voice, it's because I'm a guest host. Colin McCormick, the parish administrator, has turned the tables on our illustrious host, Nicholas Brouillard, who is the subject of today's podcast. Nicholas, welcome to VOX SFX.
I appreciate it, sir. And if anybody listened to that intro episode, they will certainly recognize your voice. You were in that one too.
I've been on a couple here, but we have decided to turn the tables because, as I mentioned to you several weeks, if not months ago, you have an interesting story to tell. And so here we are. You are in the interviewee seat, and I am doing the interviewing. What we want to talk about today is about Nicholas, and specifically your conversion story. For those of you who don't know, like many Catholic churches, we have open doors to people who are seeking to find a home. And many people go through this process annually at churches across the country, if not across the world. And it's more common than you may think to visit with people and for people to come to the conclusion that perhaps my home is in the Catholic Church. And this is the case with yourself. And so we want to get to hearing a little bit about your story. But before we get there, let's start where you are today. So who is Nicholas Brouillard and your connection to St. Francis Xavier?
Well, at the moment, I'm a parishioner, of course. I'm a cantor, and I serve in that. I haven't been doing much this summer because I was anticipating a worse smoke season. So far, it has proved me the fool. But
well, knock on wood.
Yeah, exactly. But through that, I also became a cantor for weddings and funerals, working with Nita Smith, and that's a big honor to be able to be there for such momentous days for people. And then I'm also the director for this podcast, VOX SFX.
One of the things that came to us as staff members as you began your career as cantoring, for those of you who are not familiar, Nicholas as a cantor is one who sings and guides the entire church, the congregation, in singing from the ambo throughout the Mass. And when you arrived on the scene with your voice a couple years ago now, I think, everyone was just amazed and surprised at how beautiful your voice was. And of course, we took notice that might be a good way to get you involved with VOX SFX, because you certainly have the right voice. But today we're talking about your conversion, because you are not a cradle Catholic, what we call people like myself, who was born to Catholic parents, raised in a Catholic household, went to Catholic grade school. I went to a Catholic high school and a Catholic college. Oh. So I might be referred to as a card-carrying Catholic. However, the faith journeys are quite different, and we can get into that a little bit. But tell us a little bit about how and where you grew up and what faith tradition you had been raised.
Well, when I was first born, I don't tell anyone, and of course I say that on a recording that's going to be broadcast, but I was actually born in California. But it was on an Air Force base, so I consider myself property of the United States. And immediately after that, my mom moved me up here, and we lived with my grandparents in Thompson Falls for a good while. The church up there was a Methodist church. And, well, I say Thompson Falls because that was the largest city, air quotes, to where we lived. It was technically White Pine, and I'm pretty sure the entire town of White Pine fit into our little church. And so it meant for a very close and supportive community, and that's where I first came into my faith. And Mary Harker was the pastor there, and she was just this down to earth sort of person. I mean, she worked a ranch. She wasn't, of course, full-time pastor. She did other work, and she worked on a ranch. And so when she delivered her sermons, they were always extremely practical. You know, there wasn't a whole lot of like highbrow kind of up here. She was talking to good old country folk, and so there was a lot of practical application for her sermons. But then we moved down here to Missoula, Montana, and we kind of bounced around a little bit. We went to a Lutheran church out in Bonner, which was close to East Missoula. My parents have never been huge churchgoers, or at least when I was younger. My father actually, or my stepfather, is now a member of the one church, or it's over there on Reserve. But he wasn't super into religion when I was growing up. My biological father is Catholic, as is that entire side of the family, but he isn't a practicing Catholic. Or at least not very much. He's kind of a creaster, as it were.
A creaster, someone who doesn't practice regularly, but might show up for Christmas and Easter and funerals or what have you, weddings and that sort of thing. So we say that tongue in cheek. But so someone who wasn't regularly attending church. Tell me a little bit more about your siblings and your family growing up in Thompson Falls. What was the household faith like?
Well, the household faith was kind of driven as more of an open thing. My mother, while a Christian herself and a member of the Unitarian Church here in Missoula, has always been very open. And so she allowed me the opportunity to explore a lot of different religions. In fact, that led to what my major was in college, which was religious studies. Exploring religion from an academic sort of setting, because I found religion fascinating, the way the divine manifested in all these different cultures. But of course, as I was looking around, my faith was always firmly rooted in Christianity. It was just fascinating to see. A family life was it was a lot of work. My brother and I were very much not on our own necessarily, but I was able to take care of him a lot. My parents had to work very hard when we were kids, and to provide for us. We always had food on the table. We always had a place to live, but my parents worked hard for that, and so I had that as an example. My early inspirations, in fact, for my faith were Mary Harker, as I talked about, and then my grandmother and my mother, because of how devout they were.
Sure.
And my mother for her ability to be a single mom when I was younger, and then she's always been an inspiration for me in one way or another.
In a previous conversation you and I had, you described yourself as having been a religious kid, interested in religion. And as you mentioned, as you went to college, you actually studied theology.
Yes, sir.
What do you mean by when you say you describe yourself as a religious kid?
I've always had the habit of praying.
Okay.
I've always felt that connection, and I guess it's hard to explain. I've always known that God was there, even in my darkest moments, and I've always spoken to God. And so regardless of where I was in life or what was going on, there's always been this core component of faith in some level, and whether or not that was manifested in a religious sort of way, in like going to church, or whether it was a quiet contemplation. God was always there.
So it's interesting that we note that, because you were always faithful, faith-filled. You always, of course, you were brought up as a Christian. A little different maybe from some folks who maybe had sworn off religion, or, were raised agnostically, or... and so that provided a strong basis, I imagine, as you began this journey. So we'll jump forward a little bit. Your family ends up moving to Missoula, and this is when it sounds like you began to look around a little bit.
Yes, sir.
So take us from there.
Well, like I said, the Lutheran church was the first one we went to, and it was a really solid church out there in Bonner. They have a fantastic kind of community there. But I became somewhat isolated when I was younger from the youth program there, because I was asking a lot of questions that either the youth, not minister, but the kind of...
Youth director.
Youth director, yeah. She was unable to answer. And so we eventually stopped going there, not because of that necessarily, but because my parents lost interest. Then in kind of middle school, I went to the Missoula Alliance, which is an evangelical kind of mega church up there on the hill, and it was a lot of my story begins with, so there was this pretty girl, but that's the reason I went there, and I never felt satisfied there.
So you accompanied her to that particular church,
her and her family, because they were very religious, and so again it was filled with energy. You know, it was kind of a concert setting and very, very exciting, but I didn't feel the touch of the Holy Spirit there.
Yeah, we have fortunately, many wonderful faith communities throughout Missoula, of many different, Christian backgrounds. And yet you were still searching for something. And at that time, did you know what you were looking for?
I knew I wanted more focus. More focus on the Word, more focus on God, and less on the performance, which is what it felt like. You go and there would be this band, there would be this whole production, and I felt like the focus was on them, not on God. And so I was looking for a place where that was the case, where there was this quietness to it. And I found it in high school when I began to attend Christ the King with my good buddy Kyle Crawford.
And what was that experience? What struck you as being different attending Christ the King, which is, for those of you outside of Missoula, it's one of our local Catholic parishes?
What I loved about Catholic liturgy, just to begin with, was, again, the detail that's gone into it. The study. Like, you can tell that all these priests that are talking are very well-schooled in their topic, and there's a continuation of the journey. There's this idea of telling the story and putting it in context. One of the things that always bothered me about like the mega churches and stuff is that when they put their sermons together, they cherry-picked. They would cherry-pick these verses from around the Bible to prove their point. And if you do that, you can prove any point. You can twist it to whatever you want. But with the scholarship within the Catholic Church, you don't do that. We have the way to say this is the contextual way to interpret it, and that is nice for me because it takes away that ambiguity, and it takes away the ability to abuse Scripture to create a personal message rather than God's message.
So would it be fair to say that part of your interest or intrigue was an intellectual one, if you will?
Absolutely.
And you began receiving that, or at least you began feeling like you were getting that at Christ the King. When did your heart follow along behind your brain in this pursuit? Was it still pretty much an intellectual pursuit, or did you feel at some point kind of called emotionally?
I was beginning to feel called emotionally. The liturgy at Christ the King wasn't quite, and the setting being so modern wasn't quite what I was looking for. But within our ritual, within the focus that is put into the Eucharist, I began to feel the call. Because in like the Protestant churches I'd been in, you'd have the Eucharist maybe once a month, and it just, having it every single time was nourishing. And I didn't partake personally, because of course I hadn't been confirmed yet, but just going up and receiving that blessing continually and seeing how it bonded the community together. And then I love the ritual or movement ritual, if only because it is impossible to fall asleep if you are tired.
Oh, I don't know if that's entirely true.
It's more difficult.
I will chide some of our beloved pastors and priests by making sure that they know they have to keep the congregation awake. And they all take it with, as intended. So I want to explore this just a little more deeply. There are lots of reasons why people may choose a particular church or a particular faith. And as you said, there's even differences between some Catholic churches, although the rite and the liturgical year, of course, is all the same. But the setting is different. Right. Sometimes the way music is done is different. What time of day the masses are, although primarily on the weekends, of course, and some have weekday masses, some don't. But even if you go outside Catholic churches, as you mentioned, some churches have a lot more music, as you mentioned, a bit more of a production. But some people, that really resonates with them because they really find God in that setting. And so it's really a very personal journey is what I'm getting at. And so what church you choose or what faith you choose is something that people often are called to because something is resonating, right? And so this began as an intellectual pursuit and then became a bit more of a calling for you.
And that happened when I first came to St. Francis Xavier. Okay. That's when my heart really kind of was absorbed into Catholicism and into the belief that this was the right path for me. And I first started attending St. Francis because of a pretty girl. And she actually still attends here. And of course, we're not together. We're acquaintances at this point. Yeah. And even at the time, she considered me a friend, if not a mild annoyance, because the first time I walked in the doors, I thought to myself, I'm home. This is the place where I'm supposed to be.
And was that something that you were detecting with your senses or something detecting in your heart or both?
All of the above.
Okay.
It just permeated my entire being.
This is an interesting subject, and the reason I'm asking these questions is as a cradle Catholic, I never was without the Catholic Church. And so there are times when you feel very much in tune and drawn to the altar and to the ritual of the Mass and the depth of the sermons. And there were times, quite frankly, as a kid and teenager and young adult, I would drift off during Mass and think about the to-do list at home or what have you. And I think maybe that's a common human, sort of characteristic. But I don't have any basis of comparison because I've always found a home in the Catholic Church, have not felt a desire to move on from the Catholic Church or to move away from the Catholic Church. So it always intrigues me. And incidentally, I think in my moving to Montana, which was all of 15 years ago already, I have met more converts here in Western Montana than I think I ever met growing up in the Midwest. And I find that interesting. So the conversation I'm having with you and the reason why I wanted to be interviewing you today was because of my friends who are converts. I find this a fascinating journey. It's a journey I did not have to make, although one could argue I make it daily, being a Catholic. But you chose this path and you chose this journey, and so for some people, it's very different, right? What they're drawn to, or what might be calling them to the Catholic faith. Do you have any insight as to why you might have landed in the Catholic Church beyond the pretty girl?
Like I said, I was called even after she and I stopped hanging out. She had moved to. I can't remember where she moved to, but I stayed. I kept going because there was just something there that continued to call to me. And I just felt called to the altar. And within Catholicism, I found the structure I was looking for. I found the connection to the past that I was looking for in the traditional liturgy that was being done, and that profound idea that I was a part of something 2,000 years old and continuing onwards, that had done all of this in the world. And again, there was just this, whenever I looked up there to the crucifix, he spoke to me. Not in like an actual verbal sort of way, but there was, even now, I'll sit there in Mass before things kick off, just looking at him, just thinking, contemplating.
Absolutely. So at some point then you decided, well, I got to make this official. You entered the RCIA program. That's the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults. The name is now being changed, not to confuse everyone, but it's now the Order of Christian Initiation for Adults, or OCIA. You finally picked up the phone, or you bumped into somebody and said, it's time for me to join the Catholic faith. Tell me a little bit about that process and that decision to not just be attending, not just showing up, but deciding, okay, I want to be in the church.
Well, once I'd kind of made that decision, I reached out to Wendy Crawford, who is my buddy Kyle's mother.
Okay.
And we had a close relationship when I was in school as well. She's a really fun person. But she agreed to be my sponsor.
Okay.
And so I went through the RCIA process at the time. It was being headed up, or at least I was being taught, by Deb Johnson. Our listeners will recognize her voice from the Rosary section that we did. But she was wonderful, and that introduction to the church just deepened my desire to be a part of it. In addition to that, I was studying at the university with Dr. Dietrich, who was a parishioner here, and I didn't actually know that he was for the longest time, but I was in his classes. And even though we were studying it from an academic point of view, which is to say that like we removed our own spirituality from it and it was intellectual pursuit, every time we talked, every time we studied together, I just felt more and more and more drawn into it. And then at one point I went to a different Mass than I normally did, and he was the lector for it. And I was just blown away. I was like, I know that guy.
Well, Dr. Paul Dietrich was absolutely wonderful professor of religious studies here at the University of Montana, and we sorely miss him. He passed away not long ago, but he was an absolute fixture here, both at the university and at St. Francis. And you started that process of OCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation, or now the Order of Christian Initiation for Adults. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, that is the formal process by which a person comes into the Catholic faith. And the sponsor that Nicholas mentioned is also an important element. You can liken it to maybe a godparent at baptism, but this is someone special, someone close who's already a Catholic, who basically is your guide while you're going through classes. And so tell us a little bit. We don't want to spend the rest of our time together talking simply about the OCIA process, but tell us just a little bit, give us an overview of how that process unfolded.
Well, of course, it was like for most people. I had already been baptized, so I didn't need to go through that process.
That's correct. And I'll stop you there. For those of you who may not realize, in the Catholic Church, we believe there is one baptism. And so if you are baptized in any other denomination, the Catholic Church recognizes that baptism.
Trinitarian.
Yeah, absolutely. And so so that wasn't a step that obviously you took in coming into the church, because you were already baptized Christian.
Right. And it just, it deepened my faith. I already had faith in God. I already had faith in Christ. And every step that we took together and every experience that we had was deeply emotional for me, and was deeply touching. Even some of the most simple things. Yeah, it's hard to describe.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about that. During the process of instruction, learning a little bit more about the Catholic history and Catholic faith, and specifically the sacraments, because ultimately beyond baptism, you would have received First Communion and confirmation. Did you have any second thoughts? Like, uh-oh, what have I gotten myself into? You obviously are a very faithful person, so I ask that question in sort of a tongue-in-cheek way. But during that process, you mentioned it was emotional. Did you ever think about, hey, what am I doing? What does my family think about this? Some of those questions pop into your head?
Well, the only time that I had any sort of hesitation was before my first confession. And it was because I was afraid of bearing my soul to another human being and being vulnerable in that sort of way. Like we talk to our friends.
Sure.
And we talk to our family, but there's things that we don't talk about. And those are the sorts of things that we bring to God. And so that was an intimidating process for me. My family was extremely supportive. I got teased a little bit, much like at that time I was also preparing to go into the Army. And so my whole family is Air Force, and so they've got plenty to tease me about. But I just tell them that, I was in the actual military. It's fine. But yeah, so those two processes kind of came together for me, this preparation for basic training in that following summer, and for receiving the sacraments.
So it strikes me as funny that you were in two basic training camps.
I was
one for the Lord, one for entering the Catholic Church, and one for entering the U.S. Army.
And it was very important too, because I got confirmed right before I went into to basic training.
Wow!
And I earned a nickname when I was in basic training,
which was
Saint.
Saint.
Which obviously I'm not one, but while I was there, I prayed in the morning, I prayed over meals, and I prayed at the end of the day, doing rosaries. Mm-hmm. And they considered that, they were like, oh, this guy's just, he's really religious. And I mean, I was, but it was also how I maintained my sanity.
Sure.
I was extremely cheerful for most of basic training. I weathered it extremely well, mostly because my family prepared me for it as well. Mm-hmm. But having my faith and having that developed contact was instrumental in kind of framing that. And there was speaking of confession as an aside, there was this priest who we went to, of course, Mass while we were there, and there was this priest who I went to confession for, and it was because we were supposed to consider each other brothers and sisters in arms when we were there. And there was one gal who I started to develop feelings for, and I was horrified. Because I was like, this is supposed to be my sister. I'm supposed to think of her that way. And so I was horrified. I went to this priest and I was nearly in tears confessing to him. And then he kind of gives this good-natured chuckle. And he says, my son, I'm attracted to people. Like, you're a red-blooded person. That's going to happen. It's what you do that matters. And so just in that moment, that human moment, my belief became less rigid and more about the spirit, more about the message, rather than just trying to be, I am this. I will never think about another person in this way. I will always be perfect. Our religion basically is saying you're not perfect. You will never be perfect. But it was a huge lesson for me, a huge lesson.
That's a pretty profound lesson, because I think there are still folks who maybe approach religion, whatever flavor, rather dogmatically or narrowly, one might say. And oftentimes we have to be reminded that Christ came for all, and wherever you are. Certainly didn't come for the perfect.
Nope.
And so that struck you as, okay, I've got to tone myself down a little bit, become a little less rigid, and embrace what the true meaning of this faith is. And getting back to the OCIA process of you becoming a Catholic, were there ups and downs? Was it always a good feeling the whole time? And you said your family was very supportive. Was anyone not supportive or kind of shrugged it off?
I actually had, there was one guy that I've known since high school, and he is also Catholic. But because he knew me before I converted and knew me as a kid, he always kind of raised an eyebrow as like, really? You want to become Catholic? And he's still a friend of mine, and but he was the only one that was, I wouldn't even say a detractor, but just sort of a, hey, think about this. But otherwise, again, even my grandfather, who's Orthodox, was extremely supportive. And then on my father's side, my father was very supportive. He was actually surprised because I had spent my entire youth as a Protestant, and then he was like, "Oh, you want to become Catholic too?" That's. And then my grandfather on that side was actually a member of the Knights of Columbus, which I've joined as well. And so it also felt good to tap into my bloodline, my heritage on that side.
Yeah, so there was a bit of a family connection, so it wasn't like the Catholic Church was entirely foreign to you, right? And prior to coming to Missoula, had you set foot in a Catholic church before? So first time was Christ the King.
Yep.
When you came. Now you became a Catholic in, I believe you said 2007.
Correct.
When we were speaking ahead of the interview.
That was official. That's when I was.
That was
confirmed.
official. That's
Yeah.
when you were confirmed and the process completed for you. It's now many years later. How has your faith shaped you?
It is. It's gone through various utilities throughout the course of my life. It's been a source of inspiration. It's been a source of hope, of something to look forward to. And it's been something that I've clung to in times of desolation. My brother left this world of his own accord in 2009, and it hit me really, really hard.
Of course.
Hard enough that I actually was given a discharge from the military. I lost my military bearing, as they said. And in that time, Psalm 139 comes to mind, where I ran as far as I could. I thought that God hated me or thought me ugly because of these feelings that I was having and somewhat the lifestyle that I was living at the time. But I still prayed. That was the thing. I never called myself un-Catholic. I never renounced my faith. And so in my darkest places, I still clung to Christ. And he raised me up, and through my faith in him, and through a person who came into my life who I am convinced is an agent of God, my wife. But they brought me up out of that darkness to where I am now.
The loss of a loved one and of your brother, and in the manner in which the loss occurred, is a devastating event in one's life. And many people become angry. Many people, of course, in their grief, wonder what has happened, or might have even go to the point of, well, God has abandoned us. Why would this happen? You sound like you went there for a time trying to figure this out, and yet God didn't abandon you. How did you know that?
Because there was just something there. There was a glow in the darkness, something that kept me somewhat centered, something that continued to tell me about mercy and compassion. Not compassion that I had for myself at the time. I was very vicious with myself. I held myself responsible for his death. He got cancer when he was 6 years old, and I was 10 at the time. And so I had kind of nominated myself as his keeper, and protected him and made sure that he made it through, and he survived it. And so we were very close. We were, I think, closer than most siblings because of that experience. And so when he left, I thought I had failed. I didn't blame God. I blamed me. And so it was a level of self-hatred that drove me away, because I was like, if I hate myself this much, how could God possibly love me like this? But God's bigger than that. God's sees past that.
What brought you out of that darkness? Was it a gradual process? Was it a moment in time? At what point did you, if you will, not to put words in your mouth, but when did you feel fully reconnected to God and the church? And while not over the grief of the loss, but could begin to put it in some sort of perspective?
Well, that's when the agent of the Lord came into my life. Court Cathers, my wife.
Okay.
She came at just the right time. And like I said, when you look at Psalm 139, it says, even when I go beyond the horizon, you are there. And she was the one that came and pulled me back. And then after that, I started attending church again, irregularly, but I still found consolation in it. And then COVID hit. And my illness kicked up too. I have fibromyalgia, but I didn't know that for the longest time. And so the combination of the isolation and just the constant pain and confusion drove me into another state of desolation. And so while in that place, stuff started to open up, and there was an Ash Wednesday several years ago now that I was like, I need to go. Like, it was just this call, this imperative call. And so I received the ashes, and I've attended Sunday Mass every week since.
Now, you bring up your wife, Court, lovely, lovely woman. And as you shared with me earlier, Court is not Catholic.
Correct.
And yet her presence, her love for you kind of brought you kind of back to your faith, one might argue. So the Lord does work in mysterious ways. You don't have to be Catholic to help a Catholic.
That's right.
And how does Court support your faith now?
I mean, she sees it for what it is, which is to say one of the best things in my life. My mood, my ability to cope with the world after those periods of desolation improved drastically after I started coming back to church and started receiving the sacrament regularly. Started attending confession and working through my stuff with qualified spiritual advisors, as it were. And of course, just receiving the Eucharist. And so she's seen the improvement. She's seen, just everything brighten back up. And so even though she's not Catholic herself, she can see the effects of it on me and is very supportive.
Nicholas, I have only one more question for you for our time period today. You have gone through this remarkable journey. My bias, I guess, is that I tend to hold converts in a special place, a little bit of a pedestal. Maybe I shouldn't, but I always think that people who choose the Catholic Church come to the faith in a very deliberate way, different from myself, right? Many of us who are raised in the church. Maybe those converts also appreciate the Catholic Church in a different way as well. There are things that maybe we take for granted, having been cradle Catholics.
Sure.
Information we have forgotten along the way that converts learn fresh and new mostly as adults. We are hoping that this podcast is reaching people such as yourselves, who has already embarked on this journey and found a home in the Catholic Church. What sort of advice would you give to someone who is lost, maybe is searching, isn't quite comfortable with where they're at, or maybe they're not really doing anything spiritual? What sort of advice might you give someone from your viewpoint?
Christ always has a plan for all of us. And when we embrace that plan, we attain a form of happiness. I believe that we're all created for a reason, that God put us all on this planet to be a part of his plan. And we don't have to. We don't have to do it. We have free will. We can deviate from it. We can go wherever we want to go. But there's not that true happiness. There's not that true spiritual satisfaction. But when we embrace that, when we are able to walk with God's plan for us and embrace the gifts that we've been given and use them in a way that benefits our church, our community, there's a glow. You feel the Spirit inside. And so for anybody who is lost, who is looking for meaning, this is the place for it, because it nourishes the soul if you let it.
What would you say to those folks who might say, Catholic Church, that's a big institution, and I'm not interested in an institutional church, if you will, but I am interested in the spiritual. How do you see those two kind of opposing viewpoints of what the church is.
I think that spirituality and religiousness aren't necessarily diametrically opposed, that they definitely have overlap, very big overlap for most of us. And the thing about the size of the Catholic Church, the fact that it's an institution, I mean, it's an institution that's 2,000 years old. That's 2,000 years worth of scholarship. That's 2,000 years worth of philosophical development and understanding the Spirit as it pertains to each age. The wisdom, the knowledge that has been gained in that process is wonderful. I mean, from an academic point of view, you can embrace it as something that has this deep connection. And spiritually, I don't know. It's one of those ineffable things where you're drawn. And for those of our listeners who have listened to the Eucharist episode, there's something transformative about the experience, one that you keep coming back to. So if you are hungry, you can be fed at this table.
Nicholas, thank you so much for sharing this faith journey, your faith journey with us today, and opening up about your personal ups and downs and your searching and your leanings and your triumphs and tragedies. And it really shows us that for a wide variety of reasons, as you have said, people are called. And I think one thing that we can take away from today's conversation is that every journey may be different. People may be drawn to different churches for different reasons. But there is something to be said for coming home, if you will, to a church, a family, a faith community, as I think St. Francis Xavier and many of our Catholic churches in the area are. These are wonderful communities of faithful people, all struggling,
sure,
all having ups and downs, but all attempting to maintain and improve a relationship with Christ. And I think today, with your discussing your particular journey with us, I think you've probably inspired a lot of people to start that journey. Maybe they've lapsed from that journey and they want to start in again. And maybe we'll find them here at St. Francis Xavier Church.
That would be wonderful. I'd love to share a Hail Mary with them.
Thanks again, Nicholas, and thank you for joining us today at VOX SFX.
Hey, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you for being with us today as we walk as pilgrims this road together. If you feel called to learn more, please consider checking out St. Francis Xavier or your local Catholic church. All are welcome into our community as God loves us all equally. If you are interested in supporting the VOX SFX podcast, please visit sfxmissoula.org/donate. Until next time, go forth in peace and be the light of Christ in someone's day.